This is a Stories to be Told podcast. Direct quotations from Wind of Change by Harold Macmillan, 1960, were used for the purposes of this podcast. Hi everyone and welcome back again. I'm Tracy DW, founder and creator of Stories to be Told. If this is your first time joining us, I want to give you a huge welcome to our podcast series and our growing community. The focus for discussion in this podcast is the Wind of Change speech, a critical speech at a critical period in time. I'm going to explore how this speech became a call to action for not only Europe, but for all countries that had been colonised around the world. What were the speech's aims, and whether its speaker achieved its aims, and if so, in what way? Okay, so before I get into my podcast, let's just establish what I always like to refer to as core knowledge. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Wind of Change speech, the speech was part of an address made to the South African Parliament in Cape Town on the 3rd of February 1960 by Harold Macmillan, Britain's Prime Minister at that time, who served in office from 1957 to 1963. The speech coincided with a visit made by Macmillan to Britain's African colonies in 1960. It was the first time that a British Prime Minister had made an official visit and tour of its colonies in Africa, and it wasn't just about publicity. It was for a specific purpose, which was twofold. Firstly, many African colonies had fought on behalf of the British government against the Axis powers during World War II, and were angered and resentful at the fact that they had not been rewarded for their services. Secondly, in the same year, South Africa's then Prime Minister, Dr. Verwoerd, announced a referendum to take place in South Africa to determine whether there was interest in breaking away from Britain and becoming a republic. Both these issues worried Macmillan. It is also important to note that Macmillan had made the same speech in Accra, the capital city of Ghana, on the 10th of January that same year. This visit indicated Britain's acceptance of the growing sense of nationalism and the desire for independence of not just British, but all colonies across the African continent, ruled by European powers. However, there was also another movement that was growing in influence across the globe: Communism. The Soviet Union, now called Russia, controlled many countries in Eastern Europe. Communism was also adopted by China, whose many regions unified as a country in 1912 and became the People's Republic of China in 1949 under Mao Zedong. Communism was also present in the Caribbean on the island of Cuba, with the Revolution of 1959 led by Fidel Castro. This narrative is beyond the scope of this particular podcast. However, I've set the context, so let's get back to Macmillan's speech. By 1960, there was also unrest in the Belgian Congo and in Algeria, a French colony in northern Africa. Britain was afraid that this unrest and desire for self-rule, as well as the adopting of communism, would spill into its own colonies. Macmillan's aim was to state that Britain wanted to propose granting independence to many of its colonies, including South Africa, and to encourage majority rule as the ideal model of government within them. Macmillan was also aware that in colonies in which there was a white minority, such as South Africa, these changes would be difficult to accept. So how did Macmillan try to achieve his aims through his speech? From my perspective, one of the ways was through his use of language and its psychological effects. Macmillan begins his speech by taking a softly approach, describing Britain's relationship with South Africa using phrases such as the golden wedding of the Union, alluding to the 1902 agreement, which combined the Orange Free State and Republic under British control. Take stock of your position, and other phrases such as look forward to what lies ahead juxtaposes a positive, celebrating achievements, with a warning. It's time to move on. Macmillan builds on this with key phrases that continue to focus on South Africa's achievements. Strong economy, healthy agriculture, resilient industries, and climaxes this with the phrase immense material progress, only to bring South Africa back down to earth with the phrase financed by British capital. This tactic is twofold, as it draws to our attention what has not been said just as much as what has been said. Macmillan could imply that South Africa's economic success has not only been at the expense of Britain's financial support, but also at the expense of undermining the indigenous population. Now to the issue at hand is a phrase that indicates a change of subject and to what the speech is really all about. Macmillan ensures that he is perceived as being proactive in pointing out that Britain is aware of South Africa's predicament, even if South Africa is not aware or accepting of it. Macmillan alludes to what he calls South Africa's deep preoccupation, and Britain sympathises with your interests and your anxiety. Macmillan then goes back in time, beyond living memory, to draw parallels between current events with the past. Here the Roman Empire is being referred to in order to build a bigger picture and offer a wider perspective on the issue. Empires rise and fall all the time, and the process of conquest and demise is a natural cycle within human history. The end of the British Empire and South Africa's place within it is inevitable, and a deep, keen feeling of nationalism must now be accepted as a constant fact. Finally, let's look at the key phrase from which the speech takes its name. The wind of change is blowing through this continent is a metaphor which directly refers to what the speech is all about. The fact that Britain and other European countries had to recognise the need to let go of their rule over these colonies across Africa, the Caribbean and Asia, and allow its indigenous people to not only become independent nations in their own right, but to make a choice of what social and political structures they want to be governed by, communism or a libertarianism. It's possible that all the words that preceded this phrase in Macmillan's speech was also used to soften the ear of European nations such as France and Italy, to prepare them for the reality of what was to come. Now, this was not to say that achieving independence was not a struggle for the indigenous populations. Zimbabwe, Kenya, and later South Africa were all examples of the immense suffering and conflict that was part of the process towards independence and freedom. Upon reflection, Macmillan's speech may have been a sign that Britain recognised the issues more quickly and was far more pragmatic towards the problems within its colonies. The Wind of Change speech possibly aimed to be a long-term strategy for Britain, while other European powers refused to accept the inevitable. You can read the rest of the speech and identify within it what was happening across the rest of the world at the time, and how this was shifting the balance of power for Britain and changing Britain's position in the world. And what do you think the aims of the speech were? Do you agree or disagree with my perspective on the use of language and psychology? If so, why? If not, why? What do you think were the consequences of this speech? Did this speech also contribute towards Britain being able to retain ties with its former colonies once they had become independent? And if so, then how? Did this speech's significance and possible success lie in not necessarily promoting real change, but rather in it being a prime example of Britain's ability to understand the power of the spoken word and the importance of timing? Once again, it's been a pleasure and privilege to share my learning journey with you, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. Thanks so much again for listening, and I'll see you on the next page.